Hey everyone, it's Dave Etchels from Imaging Resource. We got a cool camera to share with you today, the Olympus E-M1X. This won't come as a complete surprise to people. If you've been watching the internet lately, you'd see some teasers from Olympus. They've been kind of teasing, showing the form factor a little bit, trying to get people excited over it. And there's a lot to be excited about here. This is a really impressive new camera. It's their truly professional camera. At least that's how they're aiming it. That's the market they're going after. So let's talk about it. This is a bigger body. People tend to think of Micro Four Thirds as being small, but this is a bit larger. It's not that much larger than the EM1 Mark II with the battery grip included. So here's the new EM1X and the EM1 Mark II side by side. Here they are from the back. And you can see the EM1X is a little bit wider, very slightly. It's very slightly taller, but overall very close to the size of the EM1 Mark II when you add the battery grip to it. For comparison, here's a full frame camera. This is the Canon 1DX Mark II. Not a lot wider actually, but boy, height-wise and just in general mass, there's a big difference. This is a lot more massive camera. Plus, when you put the lenses on, for a similar focal length lens on the full frame, it's going to be a lot bigger than that focal length on the Micro Four Thirds or equivalent focal length. So the overall system still stays quite compact in line with Olympus's philosophy, but this is a beefier camera than what we've seen before from them. And now about that integrated grip, this is something Olympus, they figured that a lot of people, a lot of pros would use a grip on the camera anyway. By integrating it and making it this whole thing is one solid magnesium casting. So by integrating the grip, they ended up with a much more rigid structure overall, a much more impact resistant. It's just a really strong camera. This is in the category of cameras you can use to pound your tent pegs in the Sahara with. Also, they were careful about the controls too, so that they wanted it to be equally functional whether you're holding it in landscape orientation or portrait. And so if you look at the controls, across the top here we've got a exposure compensation, ISO, a video start-stop button, and then in the upper corner we got the exposure and focus lock and the dial control. If we go to the other orientation, we've basically got exactly the same controls. There's a shutter buttons, a front dial, except obviously there's no video button up here because you wouldn't typically be recording video in a portrait format. So here's an issue with having a separate set of controls down here. You may actually accidentally trigger them just as you're holding the camera normally. I'm just grabbing it here and I squeeze it the wrong way and I hit the shutter button, all of a sudden I'm firing off frames. So you have two options. You can lock that entirely, so now these buttons are everything down here is completely inoperative, or you have a custom lock option where you can choose which buttons you want to disable. And you do that on the custom menu B2 second option setting. And here's a list of what you can customize that you can turn off. So any one of these can individually be enabled or disabled. So inside this grip, we have the batteries, the battery compartment. And what we have here are two batteries in a tray. And the nice thing is these are the same batteries as the EM1 Mark II used. So if you're on that battery system, you can stay on it and use the same batteries in the EM1X. With the two batteries, it uses them sequentially. It drains one first and then goes to the second. The other really cool thing that Olympus has done is we now have USB power delivery through a USB-C port. This is great. You can basically run the EM1X indefinitely from a USB battery pack or an AC adapter. When you're running it from that adapter, you have to have at least one functional battery, even if it's very low on charge, in the battery compartment in order to run from USB-C power. But once you're doing that, then it doesn't drain the battery at all. Now, it won't charge the batteries simultaneous with powering the camera, but you can run the camera indefinitely off of the USB-C connector. And if you, when you stop running the camera, you turn the camera off, then it does start charging the batteries. And in fact, it charges the batteries about as fast from the USB-C as it does from the separate AC-based charger. On a trip with Olympus, I charged two batteries in the camera from about 10% each to about 90% each in around 2 hours of charging time. So like I said, very similar to what you would get in the wall charger. And it's really great. Being able to power the camera from USB-C is going to be great for a lot of applications where you might be doing time-lapse or nature photography or something, and you want to run the camera for an extended period. Likewise, for video shooters, you can run it from a USB-C pack and get essentially any kind of runtime you want from it. Oh, and one note about the USB-C, so you need a power delivery capable USB-C source, whether it's a pack or a charger. And it needs to be able to supply either one of three combinations of voltage and current, either 9 volts at 3 amps, 15 volts at 2 amps, or 15 volts at 3 amps. And when you initially plug the camera in, you'll get a display on the screen very briefly showing you what power level it's negotiated with the power source. So that's great. That's up to 45 watts of power. As I said, that's quite a bit to be able to charge the batteries with. Now, as with any of Olympus's Pro or Semi-Pro camera models, the sealing on the E-M1X is incredible. There's seals and gaskets just everywhere. And it's interesting, I already knew from our research on weather testing, that weather sealing, that Olympus tests their cameras to a very high degree. Basically, they're using way more water than you'd ever encounter in normal use. But they specify a lower level of actual water sealing or weather sealing than they actually test the cameras to. Now, in the case of the E-M1X, they just go nuts. As you can see here, they use not just drops of water falling on the camera, but jets spraying on the camera from all directions. That's an IPX3 water level. As you can imagine, you're never going to encounter anything like this. Even the E-M1 Mark II, there's lots of stories of people holding them under a faucet to wash the mud off, and yeah, that's perfectly fine. These things are really well sealed, and the E-M1X takes that to yet another level. So they test it to the IPX3 standard, but they only certify it as IPX1, which is still a lot of water. It's about 2.5 inches of rain per hour. So really, really well sealed to go along with the very rugged body. Also, in terms of ruggedness, the shutter in this is rated for 400,000 actuations, which is a really hefty amount. Most Pro cameras, you might find them at 300K, something like that, but this is rated to a full 400K. Now, another thing that Olympus has done in this camera, which is really unusual with any of these especially smaller cameras, but any camera where you're dealing with really high data rates, 4K video, that sort of thing, there's a lot of the processor in the camera in particular burns a lot of power. Even with advanced current semiconductor technology, you've still got a lot of power dissipation in the processor. What Olympus has done here to get the heat out of the system is there's a heat pipe system. There's a big heat sink inside, kind of underneath the back here. It's next to the processor card. And there's a heat pipe that brings the heat up to the top surface, and it heat sinks it into the casting. So you end up with a very low thermal impedance, very excellent thermal conduction from the interior of the camera out to this large casting area on the top. And what that does is it lets them run really indefinitely with relatively high power consumption as it's doing some of the advanced processing that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And as far as we know, this is the first time anyone's used a heat pipe in a camera. Typically, these are used in CPU coolers on computers, and the heat pipe's very different from just a normal piece of copper or something going up. There's actually a liquid inside. It's like a pipe, and at the hot end, the liquid evaporates. It then wicks up to the cool end, condenses up there, and then wicks back down. So it moves a huge amount of heat for a relatively small temperature difference, and that's a real key to the E-M1X being able to run for long times in elevated temperatures, and as I said, to do some of the advanced processing we're about to talk about. And also, for the first time now on an Olympus camera, we have a joystick control on the back. And this is great because especially when it comes to controlling the autofocus points, if I just touch the joystick, it brings up the AF display, and I can move the AF cluster around. We'll talk more about AF point selection, that sort of thing later. But the great thing is you don't just have the 4 arrow directions, but you can move diagonally, which is super handy. I can't say how much easier this makes things in the field. You're looking through the viewfinder, you want to move the AF points, and it's very natural to put them wherever you want. Other user interface aspects, we've now got 4 custom setting modes directly on the mode dial. And so this is great. Rather than having to go into the menu to select a particular custom setting that you've set up and configured on the camera, they're right here on the mode dial. So, and you can program just about anything on the camera and have it associated with a particular custom setting. Also, all new on the E-M1X is the Viewfinder system. Olympus has invested a lot in the optics inside here, and it's a 0.83x magnification, which is pretty high. And basically, it gives you a very wide field of view when you look through it. And I found even with my eyeglasses, I don't have to mash my eyeglasses against my face to be able to see all of the viewfinder display without having to move my eye around. Very, very nice viewfinder system. Very high res, very, very crisp, no distortion. Really one of the best we've seen. Two other things about the viewfinder make it unusual and excellent. First, it has a 120 frame per second update rate. That's assuming that there's enough light around to be able to drive it at that rate. But it's a very fast update, and it's only a 5 millisecond, a 5,000th of a second delay from something appearing in the viewfinder, in front of the camera, to being able to see it in the viewfinder. And even more so, when you've got rapid action happening, this is, I think, possibly the first progressive display as opposed to an interlaced display on any cameras. I know that Sony and Panasonic on their displays, their EVFs, it's actually an interlaced display like an old style television signal. So if you have rapid subject movement, you can get kind of tearing as the lines are interlaced with each other. This is a 120 frame per second progressive display, 120p. So for high-speed shooting, this is basically the same as the E-M1 Mark II. Basically, you get shutter speeds ranging from 10 frames per second in low-speed mechanical, which is what we're running here. You can go as high as 60 frames per second in high-speed electronic mode. Essentially, with full autofocus and auto exposure, you'll get either 10 frames per second in mechanical or 18 in electronic. Locking autofocus and exposure on the first frame, you'll get either 15 in low speed with mechanical or 60 frames per second with electronic shutter. The main difference between this camera and the E-M1 Mark II, though, is the buffer clearing speed. This has dual processors, again, more about that later, and also both card slots are UHS 2. So the buffers, we haven't tested yet. This is still prototype firmware we have in here, but the buffers should clear significantly faster than on the E-M1 Mark II. The autofocus system is basically the same as you have in the E-M1 Mark II. You have a variety of different size and shapes of AF points that you can select. You also can make your own grouping of AF points, pretty much any combination of height and width as long as it's rectangular. So that's a new feature. As with the E-M1 Mark II, all of the autofocus points, there are 121 of them across the frame. And all of them are cross-type, meaning they're sensitive to both horizontal and vertical detail. And really, as far as I know, Olympus is the only company making mirrorless cameras that have that characteristic. Everybody else's on-chip phase detect sensors are basically line only. And so we've seen this being a significant factor a lot of times in actually capturing focus. So one big advance with the E-M1X over the E-M1 Mark II is it has dual TruePic 8 image processors. Basically, there are 2 quad-core processors inside. You have a total of 8 cores, and this lets them do a lot of things. In particular, this camera has an AI-based autofocus mode in it. It's essentially intelligent subject detection autofocus, and it uses deep learning technology. And the catchphrase here is planes, trains, and automobiles. Olympus picked 3 categories of subjects that are very popular for people to shoot and that are very challenging for conventional AF systems to deliver what you want to see. And so in this case, here we're showing you an automobile race, and this is just a video playing from YouTube. And you can see how the camera is tracking the cars as they come around the track. This is the AI, and it's amazing that you can have all sorts of different shaped cars, different colors, lighting, different orientations. And if the camera sees a driver, it puts the autofocus point directly on the driver's helmet. If it doesn't see that, and depending on the orientation of the car, it'll put the focus point on the front quarter panel. And we got to play with this a little bit on an experiential in between the rain, and it really is amazing. It tracks almost perfectly. There are also modes for planes where it'll look for the cockpit, and for trains, which apparently is a huge pastime in Japan, taking photos of the Shinkansen, etc. And there it'll put the main autofocus point on the driver's window. And this is really amazing. They could put this in a camera. I'm told that the processing is actually done in the TruePic processors themselves. There's not specific hardware for AI, and that's because the algorithms are changing so much for them. They had to run tens of thousands of training images for each type of subject. And that's because they had to be able to recognize, the camera had to be able to recognize, cars from any size, any position in the frame, any orientation. And out of that, though, they've been able to distill it down into these data clouds inside the camera. And so it's able to recognize these subjects, track them, and put the focus point intelligently where it needs to be. This is really a huge thing. I mean, we're going to see more and more of AI technology, particularly in autofocus. but Olympus is really the first out of the gate with it. And like I said, this is just phenomenal. It's not using the phase detect at all when it's doing this. It's just looking at the image data itself and analyzing and recognizing the objects and subjects within it. Also, really importantly, is we asked and are told that this AI autofocus will be able to be upgraded and extended via firmware updates. So no promises of specific subject types or when they're coming or how many you might eventually have, but they will be adding to this collection the current trio of subject types, and we'll be adding more in the future. So huge, huge advance here for Olympus, something that we just haven't seen at all in the camera space before. Olympus has been a leader in image stabilization technology for a long time now. In the case of the E-M1 Mark II, that camera combined with their 300mm f4 lens gave a total of 6.5 stops of image stabilization. Now that's just incredible, and at the time Olympus said that what was limiting that and kept them from going any further was the rotation of the Earth. Well, I don't know about that, but now in the case of the E-M1X, with the appropriate lens attached, it can give you 7.5 stops of image stabilization. Just the body by itself will give you 7 stops. That is just amazing. It's going to be super useful to many photographers, whether they're shooting in available light or if you're shooting with very long telephoto lenses. There really is no other image stabilization system on the planet right now that can do what the E-M1X does. It turns out that part of that incredible performance is the gyro sensor that senses the camera movement. It's far more sensitive than any that have been available previously. And in fact, it was developed jointly by Olympus and the sensor manufacturer. So currently, there's no other camera has that sensor in it. We're told that the sensor manufacturer will in fact be able to sell that to other makers, but for right now, Olympus is the only company on the planet that has this kind of image stabilization in a camera. So the incredible IS system in the E-M1X has let Olympus do a couple of unique things. One of those is what they call the live ND filter system. Basically, the camera itself can simulate neutral density filters up to 5 stops of attenuation. And the way it does this, it uses the incredible IS ability of the body to hold the subject steady in the field of view for long periods of time, and then it actually constructs the blurred image by building it up from a number of shorter exposures that it takes. And so with this, you can see it actually displays it live on the viewfinder, and also when it captures the image, you get these, if you wanted to take waterfall shots on a bright day, you don't need to bring your kit of ND filters along. The camera itself can do it all on its own. Now the E-M1 Mark II had a high resolution mode where it would shift the sensor and take multiple pictures, multiple images with slight shifts of the sensor in between them, and then combine those into a higher res image. The catch is that the camera had to be locked down firmly on a tripod so it wouldn't move during that exposure. With E-M1X, you can actually do handheld high-res shots now, where it'll assemble a total of 16 images that it captures into a single 50 megapixel image. Now there's still a tripod mode where you can go to 80 megapixel images, but the handheld mode, you'll get 50 megapixels of incredibly sharp image. And it's interesting the way it does that. It's not the IS system holding the camera stable. Rather, they're letting your normal hand movement, your normal hand shake or hand tremor, move the camera, and they're grabbing pictures on the fly, which the processor then will align with each other pixel for pixel to get the final image. But interestingly though, as it's taking those shots, it'll turn the IS system off in between shots to let your hand motion move and shift the camera, the point of view slightly. But then it turns the IS back on while the shutter's open, so each individual shot is crisp, even if they're fairly slow exposures. So turning to video shooting, this is another area where the E-M1X has made some significant strides. It's able to shoot either 4K UHD at 30 frames per second, also 24 and 25 obviously, or Cinema 4K at 24 frames per second. And in Cinema 4K, it can record internally at a maximum bitrate of 237 megabits per second, so that's a very high bitrate and should be very high quality video. For 4K 30p, the standard 4K television, it's 102 megabits per second. Also new on the E-M1X is a log recording function for video. They call it OM log 400. Basically, it gives you a 2 EV boost in dynamic range by setting the base ISO. The minimum base ISO you can use is ISO 400. And then it uses a log compression to essentially compress about 2 stops of dynamic range into the signal. Unlike some cameras on the market, you can record OM-Log 400 video internally. We think it's only 422 in that mode, and we're pretty sure that if you're exporting it via HDMI for an external recorder, it's 422. But you can record the log signal internally, which a lot of people are going to be very happy about. Also, for video shooting, the 5-axis IS also means that 4K or Cinema 4K shooting handheld really is practical. Specifically keyed towards video shooting, there are 3 levels of IS available, and that's to avoid the jerking that can happen sometimes when you're moving the camera deliberately with IS enabled in video, and it'll kind of lock and then jump and lock and jump. So at the lowest IS setting in video mode, you avoid that jumping. Also now, with the E-M1X, we have face detect autofocus during video. And again, there are 3 levels of sensitivity and 3 levels of autofocus speed in terms of how quickly it'll move from one focus setting to the next. Now, as you'd expect, with all these features bundled in, this is not a cheap camera. It's definitely aimed at a high-end professional market. In the US, the price is going to be just a penny short of $3,000, and sales will start at the end of February 2019. So stay tuned. Get your orders in early with the pre-order links on our site, and let us know your thoughts.